online class students. In today's lecture, we will be looking at The Hairy Ape by Eugene O'Neill. In the last two lectures, we looked at Introduction to American Drama. We looked at the history and the political events that culminated and shaped American drama as we know of it today. In today's class, we will study Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape, which is a play which was written in the 1920s, and it shaped American drama. It gave it a new direction, and it introduced the first phase of modern American drama. Just to get a brief overview of what American drama looked like before Eugene O'Neill's Hairy Ape was enacted on the stage. Before the 1920s, American drama was largely characterized by melodrama. And by melodrama, one would mean heightened emotions, heightened acting, and there was not necessarily any subtle storytelling involved in the plays. Most of the plays had great romantic themes. They dealt with the domestic life, that is, the concerns of the playwrights were narrowed down from the national stage, the world stage, to the domestic sphere of the individual and his dealings with the outer social circles. There was an almost explicit acceptance of social norms. Those were accepted to be the rules and manners of society, and there was no tendency or propensity to challenge them in any way. The ossification of the hero and the heroine mold was another characteristic of the American drama before the 1920s. Since most of the plays were either melodramatic or romantic, the themes that they dealt with invariably invited more focus on the characters of the hero or the heroine. And therefore, American dramas for a large period of time were stuck into this binary of the hero and the heroine, invariably needing a villain and invariably or inevitably needing a solution, a resolution, a peaceful resolution at the end. In this peaceful resolution, the method to resolve the conflict, whether it was social or political, was sought to be as peaceful as possible. And hence, there was hardly any move or any attempt made to question any kind of social norms. Therefore, one would very well say that most plays before the 1920s was largely accepting of social dogma and to a certain degree conservative in their outlook. And then came Eugene O'Neill onto the American stage. If you read the title of the PPT, you will realize that Eugene O'Neill brought modernity to the American stage. Now, what does modernity exactly mean? I'm using the word modernity not in terms of the outward appearances of modernity, or rather the economic profit that characterized the modern world. By modernity, I refer to a particular outlook towards life. And what that particular outlook was, we will be looking at it in the coming lectures. Eugene O'Neill already had a sort of a baptism, a theatrical baptism in theatre, because his father and even his brother, both of them were deeply involved in the world of the theatre. He was born into a theatrical ethos into the late 19th century. His father played the character of Alexander Dumas' most popular novels, and he could not play any other role. He was stuck in that same phrase, the same image of Alexander Dumas's protagonist. Even his brother could not have a lot of success. Eugene O'Neill, as the son of a famous actor, was thus in some sense or the other implicitly shaped by the aesthetic ethos of the late 19th century American stage. In some attempt, he moved away from that, he broke away from that. Nevertheless, aesthetically, he was in some sense connected with the late 19th century aesthetics of the American stage. He had his first success with Emperor Jones in 1920. Eugene O'Neill believed in the need to move beyond these things and somehow capture the ethos or the sense of the play using other devices. Now, what those other devices were, that we will be introducing ourselves to in some time. The focus for Eugene O'Neill was always on capturing the inner form of the play. The inner form would be the essence of the play. The Hairy Ape, for example, dealt with the frustration, the sense of alienation that the modern man felt the protagonist of this play felt in this particular play. And Eugene O'Neill uses various devices, various stage, theatrical or technical devices to capture that very existential crisis. Now, what are the overarching themes that are dealt in The Hairy Ape? Largely speaking, one of the most important theme that The Hairy Ape deals with is the identity crisis that the protagonist goes through. It is almost an existential crisis that he has. Now, what do I mean by those two words? An identity crisis in this sense would be relating or equating one's self-worth with something in the external world. And that is exactly what is taken away from the protagonist in this particular play. The idea or crisis of masculinity is also dealt with in this play. The protagonist, who is an overtly masculine, strong male character, is in some sense insulted by a female character, Mildred. And that brings his identity, which he equates with masculinity, into crisis. And we will be looking at what exactly are the questions that Eugene O'Neill is raising and what could perhaps be the answers that we could be looking at from those questions. The contradictions of capitalism. The America of the 1920s was rife with a successful industrial economy. And all over the world, the age of capitalism was heralded as the age of profit, the age of industry, the age of business. But this era of profit, this era of industry also led to certain contradictions in American society. What were those contradictions? What were those class distinctions is something that The Hairy Ape tries to explore. The class distinctions between the workers and the capitalist owners is also a minor theme in The Hairy Ape. The workers or the stokers who work with Yank are part of that exploited class, which are required by an industrial society. Nevertheless, they are not given the importance that is due to them. The failed revolution of socialism. In opposition to capitalism, or rather in opposition to the invariable or inevitable success of capitalism, is socialism, which focuses on the rights of workers, which focuses on ownership of industries by the state. The character of Long, who's an associate, who's a colleague, who's a friend of Yang, is identified as a socialist. He is someone who believes in the unity of the workers, in uniting the workers to fight their slavery, to fight their enslavement, to fight their exploitation. And yet, for some reason, despite many of his attempts, he fails to convince Yang to contribute to the revolution on the side of the workers. That seems to be a recurring phase in socialist politics, where the socialist revolution, the socialist ideal, is always an impending failure. It is always a failure which is just waiting to happen. And lastly, the figure of the affluent philanthropist, the rich Mildred, who is the daughter of a steel owner's factory, is someone who believes that she is a philanthropist, someone who genuinely wants to do good for society, someone who wants to uplift those who she deems to be exploited, and yet there is a contradiction in her beliefs, or rather those beliefs stand on a very, very superficial ground. What are those superficial grounds are something that are also questions that are asked in this particular play. Let us look at a brief summary of what exactly happens in The Hairy Ape before we delve into each and every character and analyze what they stand for and what are they used to represent by Eugene O'Neill. Yank and his associates are stokers in a ship. They are workers and referred to as stokers in a ship. Stokers are workers who are used to throw coal into the steam engine of a ship. Since this is the 1920s, most ships and most engines were run by coal. Now, Yank is a character who is aggressive, who is overtly masculine, and he dominates over everyone near to him. He is very belligerent in his behavior, he is very aggressive, and a lot of that aggression comes from his sheer brute strength. Long and Paddy are the only two other associates or workers who are distinctly identified. They are not part of the amorphous crowd, but they represent two different worldviews. Long is an individual with socialist leanings, as we already discussed. He believes that the workers are being exploited. He has a theoretical understanding of the differences or rather the power differences between the capitalists, that is the class which owns the industries, and the workers which are exploited by the capitalists. And Paddy is a drunkard. He is a philosophical drunkard. He's a drunkard who understands that the workers are irrelevant in this new age and there is no point in fighting back. He yearns for something, he yearns for the bygone days. He yearns for the days when, according to him, things were not exploitative for the workers as they are today. And then we're introduced to Mildred. She is the stereotypical figure of the rich, affluent philanthropist. She wants to help the poor, but she has never been a part of the poor. She has never been among the poor. She has never even cared to mix with the poor. She has never cared to interact with the poor. And therefore, her understanding of what it takes to deal with poverty, to eradicate poverty, is very, very superficial. She misidentifies her intellectual understanding of the problems for the poor with compassion for them. What I mean by that is, she understands that poverty is something which needs to be eradicated. She understands that poverty is something which is taking a toll on the workers. Yet she doesn't understand the structural reasons why poverty exists in the first place. She doesn't understand that she herself, or the class that she belongs to, has a role to play in the continued exploitation of the workers, and therefore a perpetuation or a continuation of the poverty that they find themselves in. Secondly, she lacks the genuine compassion that someone who wants to elevate others requires. On seeing Yank, she faints with fear and calls him a filthy beast. And this is the moment, the seminal moment that marks the beginning of crisis for Yank. He has never been insulted by any of his co-workers because he keeps them under his thumb using his brute force. In Mildred, he finds someone who's completely oblivious to the world that Yank lives in, and therefore she dismisses him and in fact questions his humanity by calling him a filthy beast. Now, what exactly is this crisis that we speak of? Why is it that perhaps a very dismissive or even a humiliating statement given by Mildred leads to an existential crisis in Yank's mind, despite him being such an aggressive masculine character? The crisis is about the way in which he identifies himself in relation to the rest of the world. For the rest of the world, Yank has always been a strong male. He has always been very masculine. He has been self-serving. He has been self-dependent. He has been a strong worker and someone who's proud of the work that he does. But Mildred's insult changes that entire perception that Yank has about himself. The statement or the insult from Mildred is a downfall from the indispensable worker that Yank thinks of himself to being referred to as a mere beast, as a mere animal. And by indispensable worker, I mean someone who cannot be done away with, someone that is needed by others to work. The rest of the play is nothing but a series of failed attempts by Yank to remove this psychological contradiction, to seek answers to the questions that he has now about himself and the rest of the world, because of the insult that was hurled at him by Mildred. Even as he roams around the city looking to avenge his insult, he can't find a target. As you see him in scenes 6 and 7, roaming around New York in 5th Avenue, looking for someone to take out his anger on, looking for someone to vent his anger, he is unable to. Ultimately, he roughens up a person who is about to catch a bus and is ultimately thrown into the prison by the police. Once he is thrown into the prison, the steel bars that he finds himself behind remind him of his reversed fortunes. In the beginning of the play, we saw him taking pride in the fact that it is him who is instrumental in allowing the capitalist class to produce steam, because he is the one who throws coal into the steam engine and runs the capitalist world. But here, once he sees himself behind the steel bars, he realizes that he was not the indispensable worker that he thought of himself. He was a mere cog in the wheel, a mere piece in the larger machinery of the capitalist world. After being released from prison, He approaches a workers' union, which is known to fight for the rights of the workers, but they also have a bad reputation among the capitalist class. He approaches them to seek violent revenge against the factory owners. He wants to use them as a medium to vent out his anger, to avenge his insult, and hit out at the capitalist class. Unfortunately for Yang, he is rejected by the union. And this rejection by the workers' union as well seals his fate as an alienated being. As a being that is alienated not just from the capitalist class, but as a being that is also alienated from the working class, a class that he thought he was naturally a part of. Although he never himself identified, or rather he never himself thought of as being an integral part of the working class, but he thought that he was always a sincere worker who took pride in the work that he did. But the rejection from the workers' union seals his fate and ultimately turns him into an outcast, a figure which has been ostracized by the capitalists as well as the workers. And finally, in the last scene of the play, as he encounters Gorilla in a cage, he makes one final attempt to reconcile with the beast with which he was compared. Finding himself face to face with the very animal that he was insulted, he was compared with by Mildred, there is a moment of genuine conversation that he has with the gorilla. He thinks, or at least hopes, that as an individual who was ignored and ostracized by both the capitalists as well as the working class, he would find a companion, a genuine friend, or a place to seek refuge in the cage of the gorilla. And therefore, he opens the cage of the gorilla, he runs into it, and finally is unfortunately killed by the gorilla. And to round off the play, or to deal a final blow to his search for an identity, to his search to resolve the existential crisis, he has this last exasperated exclamation which he says, "Where do I fit in?" In his attempt to find an answer, he realizes that perhaps there are no easy answers that are to be found by Yang, and he breathes his last, and that is where the play ends. Now we will look into the characters and try to analyze them through various lenses. We will begin with the protagonist of the play, Yang. He is a masculine antiquity in the industrial age. A masculine antiquity. An antiquity is someone who is outdated, something which is obsolete. Now, in an industrial age, as a member of the working class, his brute strength is considered important. His ability to throw coal into the steam engine is important. Yet, as the age of machines is taking over, as human beings become more and more replaceable by machines, the strength, the brute strength of man becomes irrelevant and inevitably becomes obsolete. And that is the crisis, that is the problem that Yang finds himself faced with. Yang is a product of the industrial age, but he is simultaneously rejected by those who are in power, who run the industrial age, who own most of the important power structures in this particular industrial age. He deeply identifies with his work. He takes great pride in the work that he does, despite the exploitative conditions that he doesn't seem to mind. O'Neill writes this best, quote, "Man is bewildered by the disharmony of his primitive and individualism, and at war with the mechanistic development of society." O'Neill writes this beautifully, and I quote, "Man is bewildered by the disharmony of his primitive pride and individualism and at war with the mechanistic development of society." And this exactly is representative of what Yang feels. He is surprised, he is astounded, he is confounded by the disharmony, the dissonance, the gap between the pride that he takes in his strength, the pride that he takes in his individual self, which is being challenged, which is being gradually replaced by the mechanistic development of society, the mechanistic progress, the advent of the machines that is coming over and replacing workers gradually. Throughout the play, the protagonist Yang is constantly compared with this particular figure that you can see. This is a statue sculpted by a famous sculptor called Rodin, and the statue is called The Thinker. If you take a look at the image, what do you see? This is a man who is engaged in deep thought. He's lost in deep thought. And take a look at the posture of the man. He is not sitting upright. His posture is in some sense round. His shoulders are drooping. He's looking downward. His gaze is downward. And it seems as if he is burdened by the thought that he is engulfed by. It seems that he finds it almost impossible to resolve the innumerable thoughts that are constantly ravaging his brain. He is a man lost in thought, but he also seems like a man who is incapable of coming out of that thought process. He seems to be incapable of breaking that spell of thought that he finds himself in. And that is the image, or rather that is the idea behind comparing Yang with this particular image. The statue of the thinker is someone who has the leisure, who has the luxury of being in deep thought. But at the same time, he also finds himself in a crisis precisely because he is engaged in deep thought. Because the more you think, the more you introspect, the more you question, the more questions that come about, the more identity crises that you come about, and therefore you are left with more and more puzzling questions. And that is exactly what happens to Yang as well. The next character we come to is Mildred, and as we've already discussed, she is representative. She here reflects the parasitic proprietary class. The parasitic, that is parasitic in the sense it is using the labor of the workers, it is exploiting it, it is paying it very, very low wages and profiting everything, cornering all the profits and not necessarily sharing it with the workers what is due to them. It owns all the property, it owns all the power structures, including the political class, and therefore it is almost the capitalist class almost goes around unchallenging. And therefore the property class almost always goes about being unchallenged. She is also reflective of the failure of the capitalist society to integrate other sections of society. Capitalism was undoubtedly a step forward, a step beyond in an advance from feudalism. Nevertheless, it still somehow, to a certain degree and in a very subtle, surreptitious way, maintains some of those power structures, maintains some of those class distinctions, not necessarily making it very easy for people to shift from one class to the other. Over the years, it has obviously become easier for an individual to do that. Nevertheless, this is a play written in the 1920s, hence one also needs to understand the context in which this was written. Her intellectual understanding of poverty is superficial as she lacks compassion. So Mildred, or the stock character of Mildred, is representative of many of the philanthropists that you find even today. A most recent example would be someone like Bill Gates, perhaps, or even Jeff Bezos. These super rich individuals think that using their wealth, they can wave a wand and magically remove poverty from the world without necessarily questioning the structures that allow for huge concentration of wealth in certain individuals. And the reason they don't want such questions to be raised, the reason they don't want others to introspect over such questions, or rather introspect themselves over such questions, is because that would question their own privilege, that would question the fact that they are benefiting from the way we have structured our economies, the way we have structured our society. Unlike Yang, she is not very happy with her identity. That is a crisis for Mildred to deal with. Yang seems to be happy with the work that he's doing. Yang seems to be proud of the work that he's doing. But Mildred seems to be uncomfortable with the class position that she finds herself in. Mildred feels like she is in a position where she does not deserve to be that because she hasn't done anything to earn that position. And therefore her way of trying to alleviate poverty, to elevate the poor, is one way of somehow compensating for this lack, this identity crisis that Mildred herself is dealing with. Her role, although limited, is in some sense a satirical take on the pretensions of the capitalist class. The pretensions that they can use their wealth in a charitable sense and somehow remove poverty, eradicate poverty from the world. Long is another important character. He's an associate of Lang. He accompanies him in the ship and also in New York as Yank is going about trying to seek vengeance. He is a figure who has been trying to hopelessly lead a workers' revolution. He is the one character who is trying to rouse the sentiments of the workers, who is trying to make them aware of the exploitative conditions. But unfortunately, his social concerns about the workers' revolution are not necessarily shared by Yank. Yank, although proud of his work, does not necessarily feel the need to revolt against someone. He does not feel the need to question his owners, question the owners of the capitalist class. He does not feel the need to question the capitalist class because he is content with where he is, unlike Long. Although Long is sincere in his thoughts, he is oblivious to the crisis that Yank is going through. Long understands the power struggle between the working class and the capitalists, but he fails to see the mental crisis, the psychological dilemma that Yank is going through. He is too concerned with bringing about Yank to his own ranks rather than understanding the crisis, the existential anguish that Yank himself is going through. And finally, we have Paddy, who is perhaps the least important character but is the only other worker apart from Yank and Long who has a distinctive voice in the play. All the other workers are merely an amorphous crowd. And why is that? This is something that we'll discuss in the next lecture. Paddy is in fact one of the stokers who is a drunkard. He's a worker, but he neither has the pride of Yank, nor is he necessarily interested in bringing about a workers' revolution or at least starting a struggle for the workers to gain rights, to gain certain privileges vis-a-vis the capitalist class. He is an individual who has almost given up on life. He has given up on any sort of idealism, and he has no such pretensions about himself or the place that he's working at, unlike Yank. He reminisces about the bygone days where he seems to have had working conditions which were not as exploitative as the time that he finds himself in. We are not sure as to whether he was objectively right. Maybe it is the fact that he has experienced exploitation for a very long time that makes it seem for him that the older days were good enough and not the present. And for all the workers in the ship, Paddy ends up being in some sense a representative voice. He, according to him, the ship is nothing but a metaphor of a veritable sinking hell that is going to gobble up the workers and everyone else that is associated with that work. Regarding the setting and the technical devices that are used by IGNOU in the play, we will be looking at that and discussing this in detail in the next class. Thank you.